The entire firing range went dead silent. Not the polite quiet of men pretending to pay attention, the stunned, airless silence of people watching something they couldn't explain. General Roland Pierce had just handed the Barrett M82 to a woman half the size of every man on that range. A woman Chief Instructor Hale had spent the last 20 minutes openly mocking. The kind of silence that follows a car wreck, the kind that precedes something that changes how you see everything. Then Pierce saw it. A patch beneath her sleeve, faded, deliberately hidden. His breath stopped. If you've never seen a room full of soldiers go completely still, subscribe to this channel, because this story is only getting started. Drop a like, leave a comment with your city and country. I want to see how far this story travels, and don't go anywhere. The bus from McCarran dropped Lena Mercer at the Iron Ridge Gate at 06:14, 17 minutes before anyone expected her. She carried a single duffel bag that looked like it had survived multiple deployments, because it had. The canvas was faded along the left shoulder strap, where it had rubbed against body armor for years, and there was a small burn mark near the base that she had never bothered to explain to anyone. She wore civilian clothes. Jeans, a gray long-sleeve shirt, trail runners. No rank. No insignia. Nothing that would tell a stranger anything about who she was or where she'd been. The private at the gate, barely 20 years old, looked at her ID, looked at his clipboard, looked at her again. "Ma'am, this list is for the Advanced Precision Marksmanship course. You sure you're at the right Iron Ridge Proving Grounds, Nevada, Advanced Precision Marksmanship Evaluation, November cycle?" She didn't raise her voice, didn't smile. "I'm sure." He stamped her in without another word. The proving ground sat in a shallow basin carved out of high desert, ringed on three sides by low ridge lines that turned purple in the early morning and bone white by noon. The range itself was a long, flat corridor of compressed Nevada hardpan, cracked at the surface, brutal underfoot, honest in the way only desert is honest. It hid nothing. It forgave nothing. Out here, every variable existed in the open: wind, elevation, mirage, light. A shooter either understood them or they didn't, and the target didn't care which. Lena walked to the staging area without asking directions. The other students were already there, 14 of them, all men, most of them carrying the particular energy of people who had been told their whole careers that they were exceptional. Rangers, Marine Corps Scout snipers, one Delta selection washout who still wore the attitude like a second uniform. They stood in clusters, talking about round counts and personal bests and equipment they'd modified. Loud, comfortable, already performing for each other before the course had started. She set her bag down at an open bench near the end of the row and started going through a pre-arranged checklist she kept in a worn notebook. Atmospheric conditions, estimated range from staging to the 2,200-yard steel, wind flags, the angle of the morning light. Small, quiet movements. No announcement. Nobody paid attention to her for about 4 minutes. Then someone did. "Hey!" The voice came from her left. A broad-shouldered staff sergeant named Kowalski, who had the square jaw and the easy confidence of someone who'd spent a decade being the best shooter in every room he walked into. "Are you support staff? Because the shooter orientation is over by the main building." Lena didn't look up from her notebook. "I know where the orientation is." "Then you're in the wrong place. This bench is for the APM candidates." "I know." He waited. She didn't add anything. Kowalski looked at the guys nearest to him, a shared glance, the kind that communicates you seeing this, without words. A few of them grinned. "Okay," he said, drawing it out. "Okay." He went back to his own bench, but the glances didn't stop. Chief Instructor Marcus Hale arrived at 0700 exactly, the way men who prize discipline always arrive, precisely on time, never early, as if punctuality itself were a form of dominance. He was 51 years old, a retired master sergeant with 22 years in the Army's sniper community, and he wore his authority the way he wore his uniform, pressed, deliberate, without a single concession to informality. He was also the kind of instructor who had built his entire professional identity on separating the qualified from the unqualified, and he was very good at it, and he knew he was very good at it, and that knowledge had cured into something that occasionally looked like arrogance from certain angles. He scanned the line of candidates. His eyes moved efficiently. Rank, bearing, build, posture. He was reading them the way a rancher reads livestock before a sale. Then his gaze landed on Lena, and for just a moment something in his face shifted. Not confusion exactly, more like a software error. Reality not matching the expected file. "Who authorized a female candidate for this cycle?" he said. Not to her. To the range coordinator standing behind him. The coordinator, a young sergeant first class named Whitmore, cleared his throat. "Orders came down from Joint Special Operations, Sergeant. She's on the list." Hale walked the line until he stood directly in front of her. She met his eyes, said nothing. "Name," he said. "Mercer." "Mercer." He said it back like he was testing the weight of it. "You been through a basic sniper course, Mercer?" "Among other things." "Among other things." A pause. Behind him, someone suppressed a laugh. Hale didn't stop it. "This is the Advanced Precision Marksmanship Evaluation. Men here have been shooting competitively for years. The minimum practical distance in this course is 1,800 yards. You understand what that means? It means the target is a long way away." Someone behind her actually laughed out loud that time. Hale's expression didn't change, but his chin came up slightly. "That's one way to put it." He turned back to the group and raised his voice for the brief. "Listen up. 3-week evaluation. Week 1 is positional fundamentals, environmental reading, and known distance confirmation out to 1,200. Week 2 moves to unknown distance, field conditions, and team coordination. Week 3 is the evaluation proper, 1,800 to 2,200 yards, multiple target scenarios, time stress. You wash out on any phase, you go home. Any questions?" Silence. "Good. Range opens at 0800. Until then..." He stopped, looked back at Lena. "Mercer." A word. She followed him to the edge of the staging area, away from the others. He spoke quietly, which she hadn't expected. "I'm not trying to embarrass you," he said, "but I've run this course 11 times, and I've washed out candidates with a lot more in their file than you've got. Whatever got you onto this list, connections, paperwork, some general's good intentions, it doesn't matter here. The range is honest. If you're not ready for this, you're going to find out in front of 14 other soldiers, and that's going to be harder than finding out in private." Lena looked at him steadily. "Thank you for the concern." He waited for more. She didn't give him more. "That's it?" he said. "That's it." Hale held her gaze for another second, then turned and walked back to the group. She watched him go, then returned to her bench and her notebook. The first morning was fundamentals. Hale ran the candidates through positional drills, prone, modified prone, field expedient support, with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had repeated these sequences hundreds of times and believed deeply in their value. He was, Lena had to admit, a technically excellent instructor. His eye for positional errors was sharp. He caught things most people missed: a left elbow a half-inch too far forward, a natural point of aim drifting 2 degrees off the target axis, a trigger finger making contact too early in the reach. He just didn't catch any of Lena's errors, because she wasn't making any. She was quiet about it. She made no effort to display her form or draw attention to her adjustments. When Hale walked the line, she was simply there, in position, doing what she was supposed to do with no performance attached to it. He paused in front of her twice during the morning session. Both times, he looked at her position for a moment, said nothing, and moved on. The candidates, for their part, had mostly stopped glancing at her by mid-morning. The performance of skepticism requires an audience willing to participate, and the drills didn't leave much room for theater. The exception was Kowalski. During the lunch break, he sat down across from her with his tray and the particular ease of someone who considers every room a home field. "You're actually decent," he said, like it surprised him. "Thanks. Where'd you train?" She took a bite of her food before answering. "Few places." "Few places." He chewed on that. That a classified answer or a brush-off? "Whichever one gets you to stop asking." He grinned. It was an honest grin, not a hostile one. "Fair enough. I'm just saying, for the record, you're better than I thought you'd be." "What did you think I'd be?" He paused, and she watched him decide whether to say the honest thing. He went with it. "I thought you'd be someone's PR project, someone they put in a course to make a point." "And now?" He looked at her for a moment. Now I think you might actually be here to shoot. Good, she said. That's what I'm here for. The afternoon session moved to environmental reading. This was where most candidates first encountered the gap between what they knew intellectually and what they could actually do. Reading mirage through a spotting scope, the shimmer of heat rising from the desert floor that bent light and distorted the apparent position of distant objects, was a skill that took years to internalize. Reading crosswind from vegetation movement, dust behavior, the flecks of range flags at multiple distances simultaneously, and integrating all of that into a firing solution without a calculator and without time. That was the part that separated good shooters from great ones. Hale ran them through observation exercises. He'd set up target indicators at varying distances, a strip of surveyor's tape, a reflective panel, a piece of white cardboard, and have candidates estimate range, wind speed, wind direction, and mirage behavior. Then he'd give them the actual data from weather instruments and compare. Most candidates were within acceptable margins. A few were excellent. Lena's estimates were exact. Not close. Not within margin. Exact or close enough to exact that Hale checked his instruments twice on the third repetition because he thought something might be wrong with the data. He came to stand beside her after the fifth exercise. "How are you reading the wind at the 1500 marker?" he said, his voice low, almost conversational. "The flags are consistent to about 800. After that, the terrain deflects." "The dust," she said. "There's a dry wash to the left of the marker, running roughly northeast-southwest. Wind hitting that terrain feature creates a Venturi effect. It accelerates and shifts about 12 degrees right before it reaches the target zone. The dust cloud off the range road is giving me the indicator. You can see the leading edge curling right instead of moving straight down range." Hale looked where she was looking. He was quiet for a moment. "You've shot in desert before," he said. "Some." He nodded once and walked away. He didn't give her a compliment, but he also didn't say anything dismissive, and she noticed the difference. The first week passed. Lena moved through it the way she moved through most things, efficiently, quietly, without drawing more attention than necessary. She was not the loudest shooter in the group. She was not the most visibly dramatic. But by the end of day 5, a few things had become clear to the candidates paying attention. She never missed a call out during observation drills. She had never needed a second attempt on a positional exercise, and she ate her lunch alone every day and didn't seem particularly bothered by it. Kowalski had started gravitating toward her during breaks. Not romantically. She'd made that boundary clear without saying a word, through the simple architecture of her body language. But professionally, the way soldiers sometimes recognize something in each other that transcends the usual social categories. "You're going to be the top of the board at the end of this," he told her on day 6, during a water break between afternoon sessions. "Don't know that yet." "I do." He wasn't bragging, he was being honest. "And Hale knows it too. That's why he hasn't given you a hard time since that first day." "He's a professional," she said. "When the evidence changes, he adjusts." Kowalski looked at her sideways. "You're being generous." "I'm being accurate." He considered that. "You ever lose?" he asked. "Like, actually fail at something?" She thought about it for a moment, and it was a genuine pause, not a performance of consideration. "Yeah," she said, "more than once." "And?" "And I learned what I needed to learn and moved on." He waited for more. She didn't add anything. He'd been around enough to recognize when someone had been through things they didn't put words to, and he was smart enough not to push. "All right," he said. "Fair. But?" On the morning of day 8, Lieutenant General Roland Pierce arrived. He came without announcement and without fanfare, which was itself a kind of announcement to anyone paying attention. Generals didn't come to proving ground evaluation courses to observe basic fundamentals training. When they came at all, it was for a reason that hadn't been shared with the candidates or the instructors. He was a tall man, lean through the shoulders in the way long-distance runners sometimes are, with gray at his temples and the composed face of someone who had spent decades making decisions that cost things. He wore his uniform without decoration beyond his rank insignia and a single service ribbon that those who recognized it would know meant something significant. He shook Hale's hand. They exchanged a few words that no one nearby could hear. Hale's expression during that exchange was careful, the careful face of a man who didn't know quite what the visit meant. Then Pierce took a position at the edge of the range, arms clasped behind his back, and watched. Lena noticed him arrive. She gave him the same amount of attention she gave everything else. A brief, accurate assessment, then back to the work. The morning session was environmental integration, reading multiple wind indicators simultaneously across a 1,800-yard range corridor, accounting for terrain features, providing firing solutions without instrumented data. Hale ran the exercise hard, adding time pressure and deliberate distractors. A vehicle moved along the range road during the observation phase, kicking up dust at a critical indicator point. A range safety officer called an interruption at a key moment and then rescinded it 30 seconds later. Small, controlled chaos. Lena worked through it without hesitation. When Hale called the exercise and collected solutions, he spent a long moment looking at her data card. Then he looked up at General Pierce, who had moved to stand a few feet behind him during the assessment. "Mercer," Hale called. She stood. "Your solution on target 3. Walk me through it." She did. Clearly, precisely, with the specific vocabulary of someone who had done this in conditions that were not a training exercise. She referenced the Venturi effect in the draw 200 yards left of the target, the afternoon light's impact on mirage behavior at the 1500 line, the reticle compensation required for the 3-degree upslope from her position to the target. When she finished, the range was quiet for a moment. Pierce said nothing. He was watching her the way he'd been watching her since he arrived, with the focused, unreadable attention of someone taking careful inventory. That evening, Hale assembled the candidates for an informal debrief. Performance updates, areas of emphasis for the following day, administrative notes. Standard end-of-day structure. Then he said something no one expected. "Tomorrow, we're advancing the timeline." He looked around the group. Week 2 protocol. General Pierce has requested that we accelerate to unknown distance, live engagement scenarios. Morning starts with the long-range platform. He paused. "And I'll be putting one candidate up for the 2,200-yard engagement first thing." The room went quiet in a particular way. 2,200 yards was the outer boundary of the evaluation, the distance reserved for week 3, the final assessment. Nobody had been expecting it on day 9. Kowalski looked at Lena. She was writing in her notebook and didn't look up. "Who?" someone asked. Hale looked at the group for a moment. "Mercer." The silence changed texture. It went from surprise to something more complicated, part anticipation, part the uncomfortable awareness that they were about to watch either something impressive or something that would not go well for her. A few of the candidates shifted in their seats. Nobody laughed. The easy mockery of day 1 had been quietly set aside sometime during the previous week without anyone formally declaring it over. Lena closed her notebook. 0800, she said. 0800, Hale confirmed. She nodded. That was all. That night, she sat on the edge of her bunk in the BOQ quarters at the far end of the compound and looked at the ceiling for a long time. She was not afraid of the shot. She had made harder shots, in worse conditions, at targets that shot back. The distance was real but manageable. The environmental variables were complex but readable. She had the experience and the physical skill to execute. What she was thinking about was Pierce. She knew who he was. She'd seen his name on orders before, classified orders, the kind that moved through channels most people in the Army didn't know existed. She hadn't worked directly for him, but she knew the organizational structure well enough to understand what his presence here probably meant, and it wasn't something she was prepared to examine closely before she needed to. She picked up her notebook again and reviewed her environmental data from the afternoon session. Wind patterns for this part of Nevada tended to shift between 1,400 and 1,600 hours, pulling from the south-southwest and carrying a consistent rotation across the valley floor. Tomorrow morning, the pattern would be different, calmer in the early hours, building through mid-morning. She'd need to be watching the indicators from the moment she stepped onto the range. She turned off the light at 21:30. Outside, the desert was very quiet. Somewhere on the ridgeline to the north, a coyote called once and then stopped. Morning came gray and cold. The candidates assembled at 0750. The Barrett M82 was set up at the primary firing point, a massive anti-material rifle, 50 caliber, 10 pounds of trigger pull, a muzzle blast that physically moved the air around the shooter. Some of the men had looked at it with the particular expression of people who respected something they also found slightly intimidating. Hale stood beside it, hands in his pockets. General Pierce was already there. Off to the left, 3 range safety officers, a spotter with a high-powered spotting scope, and Whitmore with a clipboard. The audience was small and official, but the weight of it was significant. The 2,200-yard target was a steel plate, 1 foot by 1 foot, positioned on the far side of the valley floor. In the flat gray morning light, it was barely visible as a faint rectangular outline. At that distance, a human target would be a suggestion, not a shape. Kowalski came to stand beside Lena for a moment. "You need anything?" he said. "No." "You sure?" She looked at him briefly. "I'm sure." He nodded and stepped back. Hale walked to where she was standing. "There are people here who think I arranged this to humiliate you," he said, his voice low. "Did you?" A pause. "I arranged it because Pierce asked me to put my best candidate up first thing, and you are my best candidate, whether I like that or not." She held his gaze. He didn't look away. "That's an honest answer," she said. "It's the only one I've got." He gestured toward the rifle. "Whenever you're ready." She picked up the Barrett with both hands, carried it to the firing mat, and lay behind it. The range went silent. She took 4 minutes to prepare, adjusting the bipod by millimeters, confirming her natural point of aim, settling her cheek weld on the stock. Then she went still. Completely still, the way she had learned to go still in positions where movement meant death. Her breathing slowed to something almost imperceptible. Her eyes tracked the wind indicators, the small flags at 500 yards, the surveyor's tape at 1,100, the dust behavior in the wash at 1,800, and beyond that, the nearly invisible shimmer of heat beginning to build off the steel target. The valley breathed. The wind was consistent, but there was a shift coming. She could see it in the dust at the far end of the range, a subtle, directional change that would cross the bullet's path in approximately the 3 to 5 second window after the shot broke. She'd need to account for it, and the only way to do that accurately was to know exactly when the shift was going to arrive. She watched. She waited. Hale stood perfectly still behind her. Pierce stood perfectly still off to the left. The 15 other men on that range stood perfectly still, held by something they couldn't name. Not expectation exactly, but the awareness that whatever was about to happen, they were going to remember it. The shift in the dust pattern began. Lena exhaled halfway. Her finger found the trigger, and the world split open. The Barrett discharged with a concussive crack that rolled across the valley like a physical thing, a wave of compressed air that the men standing nearby felt in their chests before they heard it. The rifle recoiled hard. It always recoiled hard. It was designed to recoil hard. But Lena had already accounted for it in every aspect of her position, and she absorbed the energy without losing her sight picture, staying behind the scope as the muzzle climbed and came back down. 2 seconds of silence. Nobody moved. Then, from 2,200 yards away, floating back across the morning desert like a coin dropped on concrete. Ping! The spotter looked up from his scope. He said one word. Center. The word landed in the silence like a stone dropped into still water. Center. For a moment, nobody on that range processed it. The spotter said it again, not louder, just clearer. Center hit, confirmed. And even then the information seemed to travel slowly, like it had to pass through something dense before it reached the men standing there. Hale was the first to move. He walked to the spotting scope himself, bent down, and put his eye to the glass. The steel plate at 2,200 yards was small enough at this distance to be almost theoretical, a faint gray rectangle shimmering in the morning heat, but the scope brought it close enough to see the mark. Dead center. Not edge, not halfway. The strike was precisely at the geometric middle of the plate, the kind of placement a shooter might achieve once in 50 attempts under ideal conditions, let alone on a cold barrel, first round, in open terrain crosswind. He straightened up slowly. Behind him, the candidates were very quiet. Not the performative quiet of men pretending patience, the actual quiet of people recalibrating. Lena had already unloaded the Barrett. She cleared the chamber, engaged the safety, and set the rifle on its bipod with the muzzle pointed safely downrange. Then she stood, brushed the hardpan dust from her elbows, and picked up her notebook from the mat beside her. That was the part that stayed with people afterward. Not the shot itself. The afterward. The complete absence of theater. She didn't look at anyone. She didn't wait for a reaction. She just moved to the next thing, like the shot was already in the past, and the past was where it belonged. General Pierce watched her walk back to the staging area. His expression hadn't changed, but he unclasped his hands from behind his back for the first time since he'd arrived and put them in his pockets, which was, for a man like Pierce, roughly equivalent to exhaling. Hale turned to face the candidates. "All right," he said. His voice was controlled. "Range is hot. We're moving to Day 9 protocol. Kowalski, you're up on the M24. Nobody said anything about what they'd just seen. Not then. There'd be time for that later, in the bunk room, over food, in the particular decompression language of men who've witnessed something they need to talk around before they can talk about. For now, there was work to do. The rest of the morning moved fast. Hale pushed the pace harder than he had all week, which Lena recognized as its own kind of response. Not to her specifically, but to the disruption a single exceptional performance creates in a structured environment. When something unexpected happens, men like Hale restore order through activity. More drills, tighter time windows, increased complexity. The course reasserted itself over the anomaly. She was fine with that. She preferred working to waiting. The Day 9 protocol moved candidates through unknown distance estimation, followed by live engagement on targets that ranged from 800 to 1,100 yards. No measured distances, no instrumented data, just terrain reading, mile dot ranging, and the accumulated judgment of however many hours a shooter had spent behind glass. Hale called each candidate up individually, observed their ranging process, and assessed the engagement. Lena was called third. The target Hale gave her was a steel silhouette positioned in a fold of terrain that made distance estimation genuinely difficult. The fold compressed apparent depth, making the target look closer than it was. She ranged it with her scope, cross-checked against terrain features she'd measured during the morning environmental briefing, and arrived at an estimate that put it at 1,340 yards. "Solution," Hale said. She gave it. Elevation, wind hold, atmospheric compensation. She didn't rush it, and she didn't pad it with unnecessary language. Hale looked at his data card. Estimated range is 1,310. 30 yards variance, she said. That's within acceptable margin. But you're a little long. What led you there? The terrain fold is creating a parallax effect. It's compressing the depth cue I'd normally use to anchor the far edge of the feature. I added margin to compensate, but I overcorrected slightly. He looked at her for a moment. You know you overcorrected while you were doing it? I suspected it. And you went with it anyway? The overcorrection was conservative. In a live scenario, a 30-yard long estimate costs you a site adjustment. A 30-yard short estimate costs you the target. Hale said nothing for a second. Then, engage when ready. She did. The target rang. He moved on to the next candidate without comment. But Lena noticed, as she was walking back to her position, that he wrote something on his clipboard that he crossed out and rewrote. She didn't ask what it was. The afternoon brought clouds. They came in from the southwest, the kind of high desert clouds that look decorative until they start interacting with the range corridor, blocking the sun in irregular intervals, shifting the light conditions from minute to minute, changing the mirage behavior and the shadow patterns on the terrain. For the candidates, it was an unwelcome complication. For Lena, it was data. During the afternoon observation session, Hale added a moving target component, a target carrier running on a track at 1,100 yards, 3 miles per hour, and the candidates had to estimate lead and engage within a 4-second window after the command. 3 attempts each. Most candidates hit 2 of 3. A few hit 1. Kowalski hit all 3 and looked quietly pleased about it. Lena hit all 3 and didn't look like anything. During the debrief, a candidate named Vickers, a Marine Scout sniper with a wide face and a bluntness he wore without apology, raised his hand. Sergeant Hale, question. Go. The morning shot, the 2,200. That was a cold bore, first-round engagement. How do you factor that into the evaluation? Hale looked at him. What's your question specifically, Vickers? My question is whether it counts differently. Because a cold bore shot at max distance, first round, that's not what the evaluation is designed to assess. That's beyond the assessment criteria. Your question, Hale said carefully, is whether exceptional performance should be discounted because it exceeds expectations. Vickers paused. That's exactly what you asked. Hale's voice was flat, Not hostile, but without flex. Performance is performance. The evaluation assesses what candidates demonstrate. If someone demonstrates beyond the assessment criteria, we note it and move on. Any other questions? Silence. Good. Day 10 starts at 0700. Environmental brief at 0630. Sleep. The candidates dispersed. Lena was gathering her notebook when Vickers fell into step beside her. "I wasn't trying to undercut you," he said. She looked at him briefly. "I know. I was genuinely asking." "I know that too." She stopped walking and turned to face him. He was a head taller than her and had the solid build of someone who had spent years carrying heavy equipment over difficult terrain. "You've been the top of your cohort for a while, probably your whole career." He didn't deny it. "So have I," she said. Not bragging, just stating a fact. "What happened this morning isn't personal. It's just data." He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved through his expression that wasn't quite hostility and wasn't quite respect, more like the uncomfortable territory between them where one was becoming the other. "Where'd you train?" he said. Same question Kowalski had asked. "Few places," she said. Same answer. She turned and walked to the BOQ. Day 10 was harder. Hale brought in a second evaluator, a civilian contractor named Delaney, who worked with the Army's weapons testing program and had a reputation for finding errors in systems that everyone else had declared error-free. He was a thin man in his late 40s who wore khaki and spoke in complete sentences, and had the particular focused energy of someone who found human performance deeply interesting as a technical problem. Delaney's role in the course was to observe the environmental reading process and flag candidates whose methodology was sound versus those whose results were correct, but whose reasoning was flawed. Results could be luck. Methodology was replicable. He watched Lena for most of the morning without speaking to her. At midday, during the break, he came to sit near her, not directly beside her, but close enough to be clearly intentional. "You're using the wash feature as a secondary wind indicator," he said. No introduction, no preamble. She looked at him. "Yes. Most candidates aren't using it at all. I've been trying to figure out if that's training gap or if you know something they don't." "Both, probably." He nodded. "Where'd you first learn terrain feature wind reading? It's not in the standard curriculum." She thought about how to answer that. "Cold environments," she said. "You learn to read terrain features when the primary indicators freeze up. The methodology transfers." Cold environments. He wrote something in his own notebook. "That's a useful response that tells me very little." That was the intention. He looked up from his notebook. For a moment he appeared genuinely amused. "Fair. I'll tell you what I'm seeing, since you probably know anyway. Your methodology isn't just better than the other candidates. It's a different generation of methodology. The way you're integrating terrain features and atmospheric layering. That's not something this program teaches. That's something you developed or were taught in an environment that required it." She ate a bite of her lunch and said nothing. "I'm not trying to pry," he said. "I'm making an observation. In my work, when I see performance that exceeds the system designed to produce it, I get curious about the source." "I understand," she said. "I'm not in a position to tell you the source." Delaney studied her for a moment. Then he closed his notebook and stood. "All right. Thank you for your time." He paused. "For what it's worth. And I recognize it might not be worth much coming from someone you just met. What you did this morning at 2,200 yards is the best cold bore engagement I've personally observed in 12 years of doing this work." She looked at him. "And yet you're still curious about the methodology." "The shot was impressive," he said. "The methodology is what's interesting." He turned and walked away. Lena watched him go, then went back to her lunch. Pierce appeared again on day 11. This time he wasn't watching from the edge of the range. He was in the staging area when the candidates arrived at 0630 for the environmental brief, seated at a folding table with a coffee mug and a manila folder, and the particular quality of someone who intended to stay. Hale greeted him, and they spoke for several minutes before the brief started. Lena was close enough to hear fragments. Week 2 criteria, advanced protocol, evaluation timeline, but not enough to reconstruct the full conversation. During the brief, Hale announced a change. "We're running a 2-man team exercise today. Shooter-spotter pairs, unknown distance, field conditions. I'm assigning pairs." He looked at his clipboard. "Kowalski, you're spotting for Mercer." Kowalski, to his credit, didn't react visibly. But Lena caught the slight shift in his posture. Not resistance exactly, more like recalibration. Spotting for another shooter was a role that required subordinating your instincts to someone else's judgment, and Kowalski's instincts were good enough that that was genuinely difficult for him. Vickers and Torres, Okafor and Brennan. Hale continued down the list. The teams moved to their assigned positions. Lena and Kowalski took the far left lane, which put them on the steepest angle to the range corridor and the most complex wind environment, a natural funnel between two ridgeline spurs that created unpredictable rotational airflow at the mid-range distances. Kowalski set up the spotting scope. Lena went prone behind the M24, a smaller and more conventional platform than the Barrett, but one that demanded its own specific discipline. "Wind squirrely at the mid-range," Kowalski said, his eye to the scope. "I'm seeing two different directions at the 800 and the 1100 markers." "Rotational," Lena said. "The spur to our left is deflecting the primary flow. What's the timing on the rotation?" He watched the flags. "Looks like it's cycling about every 40 seconds, so it's..." He paused. "It's actually regular. It's terrain-driven. Consistent geometry produces consistent cycles. Time it for 3 cycles and give me the average." He did. 42, 39, 41, average 40. "Good. So we have a 30-second window of favorable condition every 40 seconds. We wait for the cycle to reset and engage in the first 15 seconds of the favorable window." Kowalski was quiet for a moment. That's smart. Give me the first target." He found it. "Silhouette, steel, estimated range, call it 950. Slight uphill approach, maybe 2 degrees. She adjusted her scope. "Wind hold? Half a minute right." She waited. The cycle reset. She watched the flag swing to favorable and put the shot down range in the 4th second of the window. The silhouette rang. "Hit," Kowalski said. He didn't say anything else for a moment. Then quietly, not loud enough to carry, "Where did you come from?" She didn't answer. She was already watching the flags. What? The afternoon brought something nobody had scheduled. It started with Vickers. His team's exercise had gone poorly. Not catastrophically, but measurably below his standard, largely because his spotter Torres had read the mid-range wind incorrectly on 2 of 3 engagements, and Vickers had trusted the bad read rather than overriding it with his own observation. The error was Vickers, in the end. You didn't outsource judgment to a spotter you weren't certain of. He knew that. The fact that he'd done it anyway, in an evaluation, in front of Pierce, had put something hard and uncomfortable in his chest that he was managing poorly. During the afternoon water break, he said something to Lena that he probably wouldn't have said if he'd been managing it well. "Must be nice," he said, "to have your partner just do whatever you say." She turned to look at him. "What?" "Kowalski. He's running your spotting calls like a junior. You give him a wine methodology and he just executes it, never pushes back. He pushes back when he thinks I'm wrong. Has he thought you were wrong yet?" A pause. "No." Vickers's jaw worked. "Right. Because you're never wrong." He said it without effect, which was worse than if he'd said it with heat. "I'm wrong regularly," she said. "I was 30 yards long on the day 9 unknown distance estimation. I overcorrected my terrain read on the morning moving target wind assessment. This morning I called the rotational cycle at 40 seconds. The actual average was 40.6, which over a long-distance engagement would represent a meaningful error in my timing calculation." He stared at her. "Being good at something," she said, "isn't the same as being infallible. I notice my errors because I have to. Because in my experience, the errors you don't notice are the ones that matter." Vickers looked at her for a long moment. The hard thing in his chest seemed to shift slightly, not dissolving, but moving to a place where it was less in the way. "Your experience," he said. "Yes." "Which you're not going to tell me about." "No." He nodded, once, slowly. Then he picked up his water bottle and walked back to his position without another word. Kowalski, who had been close enough to hear the exchange, came to stand beside her. "You handled that well," he said. "I told him the truth." "That's what I meant." She looked at him sideways. "You were eavesdropping." "I was standing nearby. There's a difference." She almost smiled. Almost. On day 12, Pierce spoke to her directly for the first time. The day's exercise had finished early, a target confirmation exercise that the candidates completed faster than Hale's schedule had anticipated, and there was a 30-minute gap before the afternoon administrative period. Most candidates used it to clean equipment or rest. Lena used it to review her environmental notes from the week, cross-referencing her wind estimates against the actual data Hale posted each evening. She was sitting on a bench at the far end of the staging area, notebook open, when she heard footsteps approach and stop. She didn't look up immediately. She finished the notation she was writing. "You're comparing your estimates against the posted actuals," Pierce said. She looked up. He was standing about 6 feet away, hands in his pockets, in the same posture she'd observed him in all week. Contained, unhurried, taking up exactly as much space as necessary, and no more. "Yes, sir." "Finding anything useful?" "I'm consistently reading the mid-valley thermal shift about 4 minutes ahead of when it actually arrives. My observation methodology is accurate, but my translation to timeline is running early. I need to adjust my conversion factor." Pierce nodded slowly. He didn't sit down. He stood looking at the range corridor for a moment, at the long, flat distance of it and the ridgelines beyond. "How long have you been doing this?" he said. "Not what's your background, or where did you serve? How long?" "Long enough that I stopped counting," she said. He looked at her then. It was a direct look, the kind that didn't require performance. That's usually what people say when the honest answer is complicated. She met his gaze steadily. "Yes, sir." A pause. The desert was quiet around them. Somewhere on the range, a vehicle was moving. She could hear the crunch of tires on hardpan, faint and distant. "There are people in this organization," Pierce said, "who believe that the metrics we use to evaluate personnel are sufficient, that if someone doesn't register clearly on those metrics, they don't register at all." He paused. "I have not believed that for a long time." She wasn't sure how to respond to that, so she didn't. "Continue your review," he said, and he walked away. Day 13. The exercise was a simulated 2-day field deployment scenario. Candidates moving from a staging position to a hide site roughly 4 kilometers from the primary target area, establishing concealment, conducting extended observation, and executing a precision engagement sequence from an unprepared position. Everything in the field was unprepared. No pre-positioned support equipment, no pre-measured distances, no pre-briefed environmental data. Just terrain, weather, and judgment. Hale assigned individual candidates to separate hide sites across a 2-kilometer lateral spread. No team support, solo operation. Lena's assigned site was at the northern end of the spread, on a shallow ridge that offered good observation angles but poor natural concealment, sparse brush, rocky ground, limited depth to the position. Making it work meant building a hide from materials on hand, which meant time, and time meant exposure. And exposure in a training scenario meant penalty points that translated to evaluation scores. She spent the first 40 minutes of the exercise doing nothing that looked like hide construction. She walked the site. She looked at the terrain, the vegetation patterns, the light angles, the approach routes from the primary observation area. She sat on a rock and ate an energy bar and watched a hawk circle over the valley to the south. Then she spent 20 minutes building a hide that used the existing rock outcropping as its primary structure, incorporating cut brush in a pattern that matched the surrounding vegetation density precisely enough that the range safety officer who came to assess her position walked within 15 feet of it before marking it on his clipboard. Her observation began at 1340. The engagement sequence called for a confirmed strike on 3 targets at unknown distances within a 2-hour window. She ranged the targets methodically, built firing solutions, and waited for the exercise clock. The first target went at 14:02, the second at 14:47, after a 20-minute wait for the afternoon thermal shift she'd calculated was coming. The third at 15:08. All 3 confirmed. She was back at the staging area by 1600. Hale looked at her debrief card for a long time. "You waited 20 minutes between target 2 and target 3, he said. "Yes." "The exercise protocol doesn't require you to wait between engagements." "No." "So why did you wait?" "Because the thermal shift at 1440 was going to add 2 minutes of uncertainty to my wind read on target 3. I had the time to wait." So I waited. Hale looked at the card, then at her. You had the time to wait, he repeated. I was already ahead of the engagement sequence. Taking an extra 20 minutes didn't put me outside the window. It just gave me a better shot. He set the card down. He started to say something, then stopped. Then, what made you confident the thermal shift was coming at 1440? My timeline correction, she said. I was running 4 minutes early on thermal translation. I adjusted the factor this morning. She paused. It shifted at 1436. He stared at her. She picked up her notebook. Will there be anything else, Sergeant? There was a long silence. No, he said. That's all. She walked away. Behind her, she heard him exhale, a controlled, quiet breath that could have meant several things. She had a sense it meant he'd just fully understood something. He'd been half-understand for the past 2 weeks, and that understanding was making him recalibrate everything he thought he'd known about the candidate standing at the far end of his roster. Outside, the sun was dropping behind the western ridgeline, and the desert was turning the particular shade of orange that existed only in that specific hour, in that specific place, and Lena Mercer walked through it without looking up, already thinking about day 14. Day 14 arrived with a problem nobody had anticipated. The weather came in overnight, not the decorative high desert clouds of earlier in the week, but a genuine weather system pushing down from the northwest, carrying with it sustained winds in the 25 to 30 knot range, and a low-pressure front that compressed the mirage layers and made atmospheric reading genuinely unreliable by conventional methods. By 0530, the anemometer at the range control station was showing gusts to 38 knots. By 0600, Whitmore had pulled Hale aside and shown him the forecast data, and they'd had a conversation that ended with Hale looking at the sky for a long moment before walking inside to make a call. The call was to Pierce. The candidates were in the chow hall when Hale returned. He moved through the room without looking at anyone in particular and went to the coffee station, which told Lena something. When Hale needed coffee before briefing the briefing was going to contain something he hadn't planned. She finished her eggs and waited. At 0650, he called them together. Change of schedule, he said. The weather system is going to make the planned field exercise non-viable today. Wind conditions exceed safe parameters for the distance protocols we were running. He paused. So we're moving to the indoor simulation component. Analytical problem solving, environmental calculation under controlled conditions, team decision frameworks. There was a general relaxation in the room. Indoor work was easier, warmer, less physically demanding. Lena watched Hale's face and didn't relax. Something in his posture was wrong. He was a man who defaulted to directness, and right now he was being indirect, saying the true thing but not the whole thing, and the gap between them was visible if you knew where to look. She finished her coffee and caught his eye as the group was moving toward the simulation building. Sergeant Hale. He stopped. Let the others go past. What's the actual plan for today? She said, her voice low. He looked at her for a moment, then, without quite meaning to, the corner of his mouth shifted. Not a smile, something more resigned than that. Indoor work this morning, he said. Live exercise this afternoon. In this wind. The general made a call. She looked toward the window. Outside, the desert scrub was bending hard to the southeast, and a spiral of dust was moving across the range road like something alive. At what distance? She said. Hale held her gaze. We'll cover that this afternoon. The morning was classroom work, and Hale ran it well. He ran everything well. She'd come to accept that. Cycling through environmental problem sets that required candidates to build firing solutions from incomplete atmospheric data, account for barometric shifts, and integrate moving weather patterns into engagement timelines. The problems were complex enough to take genuine concentration and designed well enough that most of the candidates found them engaging rather than remedial. Lena worked through them methodically, which was how she worked through everything. She wasn't the fastest in the room on pure calculation. Delaney's problems rewarded a specific kind of mathematical fluency that Okafor, a former artillery officer, had in abundance. But she was consistent, and her solutions were grounded in physical reasoning that she could explain step by step rather than arriving at answers she couldn't fully account for. Delaney ran the session. He moved between candidates, watching their process, occasionally asking questions that probed the reasoning behind an answer rather than the answer itself. He spent more time at Lena's table than any other, and she had come to understand that this wasn't favoritism. It was the attention a researcher gives to the dataset that's behaving unexpectedly. Problem 6, he said, setting a new sheet in front of her. You've got a sustained crosswind at 22 knots from the southwest, gusting to 35 on an irregular cycle. Target is at 1,800 yards. You have no electronic instrumentation. Walk me through your solution process. She looked at the problem. What's my observation time? 20 minutes. And I have a spotting partner? Solo. She thought for a moment, working through the variables. In 20 minutes, with a sustained 22-knot base wind, I can establish the base deflection calculation with reasonable confidence. The problem is the gusts. An irregular cycle means I can't predict timing the way I could with a terrain-driven cycle, so I need to establish the gust interval empirically. I'm looking for any pattern in the irregularity, which might not exist, but probably does if I watch long enough. And if you can't establish a pattern in 20 minutes, then I engage in a sustained wind lull and accept that I might have to adjust based on an observed miss. First round observation, second round correction. That costs you time and reveals your position. Yes, which is why you avoid it if you can. But some problems don't have clean solutions. You pick the least bad option and execute it cleanly. Delaney wrote something. Most candidates in this scenario default to waiting for a full lull, which in a sustained system might not come. Waiting for perfect conditions is how you miss your window entirely. He looked at her over his notebook. That sounds like experience talking. Most useful things are. He moved on. She went back to the problem. But at 7300, Hale assembled the candidates outside. The wind had not improved. If anything, it had intensified slightly in the late morning, though the gusts were spacing out, which meant the base wind was increasing, filling the gaps between peaks. The range flags were standing nearly horizontal on the 500-yard line. On the 1,100-yard markers, they were snapping violently enough that 2 had torn free of their mounts. Hale stood in front of the group with his hands in his pockets and the composed face of someone who had already made his decision and was now managing the consequences of it. Afternoon exercise, he said. Live engagement, modified protocol for weather conditions. He paused. 2-man teams. Shooter and spotter. Single engagement target at 1,800 yards, 1 round. The number landed in the group like the first cold drop before a rainstorm. 1,800 yards in these conditions was not a training exercise. In these conditions, 1,800 yards was a serious problem. Vickers said it out loud. In this wind? In this wind, Hale confirmed. Sergeant, that's a 40-knot gust environment. Base wind is 25. The deflection calculation at 1,800. I know the math, Vickers. Then you know what the probability of a first-round hit is. I know what the probability is for a shooter who can't manage the environment, Hale said, and his voice was even, but there was something flat and deliberate behind it. I also know what it is for a shooter who can. He looked around the group. This is a skills evaluation. The evaluation tests what you can do, not what conditions allow. If you're looking for a range day where everything's comfortable, you're in the wrong course. Nobody said anything else. Kowalski and Mercer, you're up first. They walked to the primary firing point without speaking. The wind hit harder out on the range than it had felt in the staging area. The terrain funneled it down the valley corridor, and at ground level it was physical, pushing against them with enough force that Lena adjusted her pace to stay balanced on the uneven hardpan. Beside her, Kowalski had his collar up, and his eyes squinted against the blowing grit. He set up the spotting scope while she prepared the M24. She went through her pre-engagement routine with the same sequence she always used, adapting each step to account for wind movement on the rifle and scope. The bipod needed wider spread to resist the lateral push. Her cheek weld required extra conscious pressure to maintain stability against gusts. Every element of the position demanded more than it would on a calm day. The target, a standard silhouette at 800 yards, was barely visible. The wind was picking up debris from the range floor and carrying it in shifting curtains that obscured the far end of the valley intermittently. The 1,100-yard wind flags were giving her a base reading, but the cross-valley terrain and the moving weather system were creating layered conditions, different wind speeds and directions at different range distances simultaneously. "What are you seeing at the far markers?" she said. Kowalski had his eye to the scope. At the 1500 line, I've got what looks like a south-southwest, maybe. Hard to read. The debris patterns are inconsistent. A pause. Lena, this is a mess. I know. Keep watching. Tell me when you see any pattern in the gust spacing. She watched the nearer flags while he watched the far end. The base wind was steady from the southwest. The gusts were adding roughly 15 knots on top of that in intervals she was trying to measure. But they weren't regular. They were close to irregular, but close wasn't the same thing. She looked at the flag on the 800-yard marker and watched it go from taut to snapping back in the gust and then partially dropping in the aftermath. She timed 3 cycles. Kowalski. Yeah. The gusts are irregular, but they're not random. There's a partial pattern. Every third interval is longer by about 8 seconds. Watch your far-end indicators and tell me if that matches what you're seeing. 30 seconds of silence. I think, yeah, I see it. The curtain at the far end clears on roughly every third cycle. It's like the system has a breathing pattern. That's exactly what it is. Low-pressure systems have rhythmic behavior even when the surface expressions look chaotic. If I can time 3 more cycles and confirm the interval. We've got 6 minutes before Hale calls the window, Kowalski said. I know. She watched. She counted. The flag on the 800-yard marker moved through 4 more cycles, and she tracked the timing with one hand moving slightly against her thigh. Not looking at a watch, just counting, feeling the rhythm of it. It was there. Irregular, but structured. Every third interval was the window. When's the next long interval? Kowalski said. 40 seconds, maybe. Tell me what the target looks like during the debris clearing. I can see it. Steel silhouette looks like it's... He paused. There's lateral movement in the target itself. It's on a flexible mount. It's swaying. How much? 3-4 inches of arc. It's not massive, but at 1800 it's a consideration. She exhaled. 4 inches of target movement at 1-800 yards required. Its own compensation on top of the wind hold, on top of the atmospheric pressure adjustment, on top of the positional stability challenge. Each variable was manageable in isolation. Together they were compounding. Behind them, she could hear Hale and Delaney talking quietly. She didn't listen to what they were saying. Next long interval, Kowalski said. Coming up. I'm counting. 15 seconds. She settled into her position. She found the target in the scope, small, moving, blurred at the edges by heat shimmer, even in the cold. She put the crosshairs on the center mass and began calculating the lead on the target's swaying cycle. It was a 2-second arc. She needed to break the shot 2 inches left of center to catch it at the mid-arc, where the velocity of the sway was lowest. 10 seconds, Kowalski said. Her breathing slowed. 5. The debris curtain at the far end of the range thinned. The wind dropped to its base 25 knots. The target's sway slowed slightly as the gust that had been pushing it eased. Window, Kowalski said. She held half a breath and squeezed. The M24 fired with a crack that the wind immediately took and scattered across the valley. The recoil was manageable. She stayed behind the scope. 3 seconds. The silhouette rang. In the wind, the sound was thin and distorted, but it was there. Hit, Kowalski said. He said it with the voice of someone who had been expecting something and still been surprised by it. Center mass. That's a hit. She unloaded the rifle. Her hands were not entirely steady, which she noticed without judgment. Her hands were never entirely steady after a shot in difficult conditions, because difficult conditions produced adrenaline, and adrenaline was a physical response she'd never fully trained out of herself. She'd stopped trying to. When she stood, Hale was looking at her from 15 feet away. He'd been watching the whole time, she'd known that. But the quality of his attention had changed during the engagement, and she could see it in his face now. Not admiration exactly, and not the simple recalibration of earlier in the week. Something more specific. He looked like a man assembling information he'd been collecting for days and arriving at a conclusion that he wasn't sure he was ready for. She carried the rifle back to the staging area. After Kowalski and Mercer, Hale sent 3 more teams downrange. 2 produced misses. The third, Vickers and Torres, produced a hit on the 3rd round, not within the single engagement constraint, but Hale gave them credit for the outcome and noted the round count. Nobody complained. In those conditions, on that target, at that distance, Hitting on round 3 was respectable work. The debrief that evening was unusual. Normally, Hale ran debriefs efficiently. Performance data, areas of emphasis, schedule for the following day. 15 minutes, sometimes less. Tonight he let it run longer, and he took questions rather than giving them, which was the inverse of his standard structure. Someone asked about the wind timing methodology. Hale looked at Lena. "Mercer," he said. "Walk the group through your interval analysis." She did. She explained the rhythmic behavior of low-pressure systems, the visual indicators to watch at multiple range distances, the timing methodology she'd used to identify the third interval window, and the logic of waiting for the window rather than engaging in full wind. She spoke without performance, just information, in order, with the natural pauses of someone thinking clearly rather than reciting. The room was quiet in a way it hadn't been during any previous debrief. When she finished, Hale asked if there were questions. Several candidates raised their hands. Okafor asked about the empirical timing method and whether it was documented in any training literature. Brennan asked about how she'd accounted for the target movement. Torres, who had messed up Vickers' engagement, asked a question about the layered wind condition reading that was specific and genuinely technical. She answered all of them without condescension and without false modesty. She got one of Torres's answers slightly wrong, mixing up a number in the mid-range indicator timing, corrected herself mid-sentence, and moved on. Nobody made anything of it. The room had already decided she was worth listening to, and that decision was durable enough to survive a small error. Hale let it run until the questions exhausted themselves. Then he gave the schedule for day 15 and dismissed them. Afterward, in the narrow hallway outside the briefing room, Delaney appeared beside her. "I've been trying to place your methodology," he said, picking up a conversation he'd apparently been having in his head for a while. "The rhythmic interval analysis for irregular cycle weather. I've seen something like it in documentation from cold weather operations environments, high-latitude deployment zones." She kept walking. "Have you?" "The specific application to fire control is unusual. Most of the literature I'm aware of applies it to movement timing, patrol insertion, vehicle approach, not precision fire." "Methodology transfers," she said, same thing she'd told him before. "You said that. I've been thinking about what it implies." She stopped at the door to the BOQ corridor and turned to look at him. He was a careful man, Delaney, careful in the way researchers were careful, tracking implications rather than making them. She respected it more than she would have respected aggression. "Mr. Delaney," she said, "you're good at your job. What you're good at is identifying performance patterns and tracing them to source methodologies. I understand that, but the source of some methodologies can't be traced, and that's not obstruction, that's classification. And I need you to leave it there." He studied her face for a moment. "Classified operational environments," he said. She didn't confirm or deny. "All right." He put his notebook in his jacket pocket. "I'll leave it there." He turned to go, then stopped. "For what it's worth, the candidates in there are going to be better for tonight's debrief than for any other single session in this course. You gave them something that isn't in the curriculum. I gave them information. You gave them a framework. There's a difference." He paused. "You're good at that too, not just the shooting." He walked away down the corridor. She watched him go, then pushed through the door into the cold night air. Day 15, the final day of week 2. Hale had scheduled an individual assessment, a cumulative exercise that pulled together everything from the 2 weeks. Height construction, extended observation, environmental reading, distance estimation, and a precision engagement sequence. 4 targets: unknown distances, field conditions, solo operation. Evaluated on accuracy, methodology documentation, and execution efficiency. Lena drew the northwest sector again. Same shallow ridge as the day 13 exercise, except now the weather system had cleared overnight and left the desert scrubbed clean and very still, the air sharp with the particular clarity that follows a past front. The distant ridge lines were hard-edged and bright under the morning sun, and every terrain feature that the dust had softened the previous week was now precisely defined. She built her hide in 31 minutes. The range safety observer who came through marked his time of sighting as not observed, confirmed concealment. Observation phase, 2 hours. She documented everything: wind by layer, thermal timeline, target movement, if any, terrain feature distances, depression angles, azimuth references. The notebook she'd been filling all week was now a systematic record of this specific valley's environmental behavior, and she moved through the observation with the efficiency of someone reading a document they'd already partially written. Target 1 was at 1,140 yards, on a slight uphill approach behind a rock formation that compressed the apparent distance. She ranged it within 20 yards. The engagement hit. Target 2 was a deliberate misdirection, placed in a terrain fold that made it appear closer than it was, the same compression effect she'd encountered on day 9. She recognized the setup immediately, ranged past the apparent distance, and arrived at 1,610 yards. Within 15, Target 3 was moving, slow traversal on a mechanical carrier, 3 miles per hour. She waited for a pause in this carrier mechanism. They always paused. Mechanical systems always had a cycle, and took the shot in the half-second stillness. The target hit. Target 4 was partially obscured, a steel plate behind a rock outcropping, with only the upper third visible above the concealing terrain. The visible portion was roughly 4 inches of steel at 1,420 yards. She spent 6 minutes on the ranging confirmation because the obscured base made conventional mil-dot ranging unreliable, used an alternative reference feature to triangulate, and arrived at a solution she was 80% confident in. She took the shot. The plate rang. She documented everything in the after-action section of her assessment form, including the ranging methodology problem on Target 4, the alternative technique she'd used, and her confidence level before and after the shot. She wrote the estimate wrong and then corrected it in the margin with a single line through the error and the correction beside it. When she emerged from the hide and walked back to the staging area, Delaney was there, and Pierce, and Hale. All 3 of them together, which was not the standard protocol for individual assessment debrief. She stopped 6 feet away and waited. Hale spoke first. 4 for 4, 3 first-round hits, 1 first-round hit on the obscured target. Yes. Your documentation on Target 4 includes a methodology correction. My initial ranging approach was unreliable for that geometry. I documented the error and the alternative method. Why document the error? Because the error is part of the methodology. If someone else is using my assessment form as a training resource, they need to know where the primary approach breaks down and what the alternative is. A silence. The 3 men exchanged a look that she wasn't entirely able to read. Pierce stepped forward slightly. Mercer, there's something we need to discuss. The quality of his voice had changed. Not harder, more direct, the way a voice gets when the conversation around the edge of a subject has finished and someone has decided to address the subject itself. She met his eyes. Sir, we've been evaluating you for 2 weeks, he said, but not for the reasons the other candidates believe. The desert was very still, no wind, no sound from the range, just the flat Nevada light and the 3 men looking at her. I know, she said. Pierce's expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted slightly. You know? I identified your name on classified movement orders from a previous assignment. Not this one, earlier. I knew the organizational structure well enough to understand what your presence at an APM evaluation in week 1 probably meant. She paused. I didn't know the specific purpose. I still don't. Pierce looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Take the evening. Tomorrow morning, 0600, my office in the main building. He paused. Not the range, not the course, the office. She nodded once. Yes, sir. He turned and walked toward the main building. Delaney followed. Hale remained. He stood in front of her for a moment without speaking. His face was doing something complicated. The face of a man settling accounts with himself. The course ends tomorrow, he said. Formally, you're still a candidate until the week 3 evaluation. I understand. He looked past her at the range for a second, then back. In 22 years, I've run 11 cycles of this evaluation. I've graduated 63 candidates. He paused. I've never had a candidate document a methodology error in an after-action form during a live assessment. It was an error worth documenting. That's not my point. He met her eyes. My point is that most shooters, even the best ones, would have quietly corrected the error and moved on, because documenting your own failures in an evaluation is how you lose points. I'm not here to collect points. The line landed between them and sat there. Hale looked at her. His jaw worked slightly. No, he said, finally. I'm starting to understand that. He walked away. Lena stood at the edge of the staging area and looked out at the range, the long, flat corridor of Nevada hardpan, the ridgelines turning gold in the late afternoon light, the distant steel plates she'd spent 2 weeks putting rounds through. She looked at it for a long moment, the way you look at something when you know you're about to be done with it. The evening was very quiet. The front had taken the wind with it when it passed, and the desert was left clean and still and honest, the way it always was when everything else cleared away. She picked up her gear and walked inside. She didn't sleep well. Not because of anxiety. She'd operated in conditions that made anxiety a luxury she couldn't afford, and that training had a way of becoming permanent. It was something else. The quality of stillness in the BOQ room felt different from the previous nights, charged with the particular weight of things about to become definite. For 2 weeks she had existed in this course as a kind of controlled ambiguity, performing, being assessed, managing what people knew and didn't know. Tomorrow, that ambiguity would end, and she found that the ending, even one she'd anticipated, required its own adjustment. She was up at 0445. She ran 4 miles on the perimeter road in the dark, the desert cold enough to see her breath, the stars still hard and clear overhead. She ran without music, without a watch, without anything except the sound of her footfalls on the hard pan and the distant sound of the highway 6 miles to the east. When she finished, she stood outside the BOQ for a moment and looked at the main building across the compound, lights already on in 2 windows on the 2nd floor. Pierce was already there. She showered, dressed in her uniform, the first time she'd worn it on this installation, she realized, since arriving in civilian clothes 2 weeks ago, and crossed the compound at 0550. The office Pierce was using belonged to the installation's deputy commander, who had made it available with the particular grace of someone who understood that generals outranked their own furniture. It was a spare room, desk, 4 chairs, a whiteboard with old marker traces that hadn't quite cleaned off, a window that looked out over the eastern ridgeline where the sky was beginning to pale from black to deep blue. Pierce was at the desk with 2 folders open in front of him. Delaney sat in one of the side chairs with his notebook. A third man Lena didn't recognize was standing near the window. Civilian clothes, the kind of nondescript competence that populated certain levels of the intelligence community, somewhere in his mid-50s with a face designed to be forgettable. She came to attention inside the doorway. "At ease," Pierce said. "Sit." She sat. Pierce closed one of the folders but left the other open, and she could see from the angle that it contained her service record, or a portion of it. The portion that wasn't classified would be thin. The portion that was classified would be considerably thicker. "This is Mr. Garrett," Pierce said, indicating the man by the window. "He's with the Joint Special Programs Office. He'll be listening." Garrett nodded without speaking. She nodded back. "I'm going to be direct," Pierce said. "We didn't bring you here to evaluate you as an APM candidate." "I know, sir. We brought you here because there's a program in development, and we needed to observe your performance in an instructional context without the observation being apparent to you." She processed that. "You needed to see how I teach. We needed to see how you operate when you're not aware of being evaluated for instruction. Performance changes when people know what's being assessed." He folded his hands on the desk. "Your performance didn't change, which is itself data." "What's the program?" she said. Pierce looked at her steadily. "First, I want to cover something, your file." He tapped the open folder. "What I'm authorized to discuss with you today is limited, but I want to confirm a baseline. You were assigned to Phantom Lance Task Force for," he checked the document, 4 years, 8 months. "Yes, sir." "During which time you completed," and I'm reading from the unclassified summary, which is deliberately vague, "a significant number of long-range direct action operations in multiple operational theaters." "Yes. The specific number and locations are classified above this room's clearance level." "Yes, sir. But I have access to the classified summary, and I want you to know I've read it." He paused. "All of it." The room was quiet. Outside the window, the eastern ridgeline was turning from blue to gray as the light built behind it. "Okay," she said. "You were offered a transition to training command twice during your time with Phantom Lance. You declined both times." "Yes." "Why?" She thought about how honest to be and decided to be completely honest because she was tired of calculating degrees of honesty. Because I wasn't ready. I still had things I was trying to figure out in the field, and I didn't want to teach until I understood what I was teaching. Pierce absorbed that. And now? I've been out of active deployment for 8 months. I've spent most of that time reviewing my own operational records, looking at what worked, what didn't, what I would do differently, trying to build a framework I could actually pass on, rather than just a collection of things I happened to know. The notebook, Delaney said from his chair. It was the first thing he'd said. She looked at him. What about it? You've been writing in it every day, not just environmental data. I observed you in the evenings. You were writing in it after range operations when there was no environmental data to record. Methodology notes, she said. Things I noticed in the candidates' errors. Patterns in where the current curriculum produces gaps. Delaney wrote something. Pierce watched her. Show me, Pierce said. She reached into her jacket and set the notebook on the desk. It was dense. Every page filled, margins annotated, diagrams in some sections where written description wasn't sufficient. Pierce picked it up and turned through it slowly. He didn't read every page, just sampled, 3 or 4 seconds per page, enough to establish the nature of what he was holding. He set it down without comment, but he slid it back toward her rather than keeping it, which told her something about how he operated. The APM program, Pierce said. The current curriculum is 11 years old. The operational environments it was designed for have changed substantially. The threat landscape, the engagement distances, the atmospheric conditions in the theaters we're currently active in, the program doesn't reflect any of it. We've been graduating candidates who can perform well on this range and struggle in operational conditions. I know, she said. A pause. You know? Hale's program is technically excellent. It's also calibrated for a range environment that's more controlled than most operational theaters. The candidates here are learning to read Nevada desert in November. Most of them are going to operate in environments with different atmospheric behavior, different terrain signatures, different light conditions. The methodology transfers, but the training doesn't prepare them for the transfer. What would you change? Garrett said. It was the first time he'd spoken, and his voice was flat and specific. Not hostile, just economical. The voice of someone who wanted information and wasn't interested in anything that wasn't information. She looked at him. That's a longer conversation than a morning debrief allows. Summarize. She looked at Pierce, who gave her a slight nod. 3 things, she said. First, the environmental reading curriculum needs to be rebuilt around variable conditions rather than a controlled range environment. Training in consistent conditions produces shooters who are excellent in consistent conditions. Second, the unknown distance methodology needs to expand beyond mil-dot ranging to include terrain feature triangulation and alternative reference techniques. The current curriculum produces candidates who are helpless when the primary method is compromised. Third, the program needs to integrate operational scenario context into the technical training. Right now, candidates learn the mechanics divorced from the decision-making environment those mechanics will actually be used in. That's backwards. Garrett was writing. Pierce was watching her. That's 3 things, Garrett said. You said that like there are more. There are more. How many more? Enough to require a complete curriculum rebuild rather than a patch, which is probably what you already know, or you wouldn't be here. Garrett looked at Pierce. Pierce looked at Lena. We want you to run the rebuild, Pierce said. The words landed without drama. He'd said them the way he said everything, directly, without wind-up. She sat with them for a moment. Define run, she said. Design authority. Full curriculum from week 1 through the final evaluation. Staffing input. Evaluation criteria. Operational scenario development. He paused. Hale stays as lead range instructor. His technical instruction is sound. You'd be his program director, not his replacement. How does Hale feel about that? A beat. We haven't told him yet. When were you planning to? After this conversation. She leaned back slightly. The chair creaked. She thought about what she knew about Hale, his discipline, his technical precision, his capacity for adjustment when the evidence required it, and the particular rigidity that lived alongside all of those things. 22 years of building a program gives a person ownership of it, and ownership was difficult to restructure around. He's going to have a problem with it, she said. Probably, Pierce said. How are you going to manage that? By explaining the alternative, which is a program that continues producing graduates who underperform in operational theaters. He paused. Hale is a professional. He'll accept it when he understands it. He'll accept it, she said. That's not the same as it working. Pierce looked at her with something that might have been respect, or might have been the recognition that she was asking the right questions. What would make it work? Bring him into the design process, not as a consultant, as a genuine collaborator. His range expertise is real. He knows things about candidate performance and failure modes that I don't. If I design the program without him and hand it to him to implement, he's going to execute it exactly as written, and nothing will work as intended. If he co-owns the design, he'll make it better than I could alone, and he'll implement it like it's his because it will be. The room was quiet for a moment. You've thought about this, Delaney said. I've been thinking about it since day 4, she said. Pierce sat back. He looked at the window where the ridgeline was now fully visible in morning light. Then he looked back at her. All right, he said. We'll structure it that way. But I want your answer first, before we talk to Hale, before we talk to anyone else. Are you in? She thought about the 8 months since she'd come off active deployment, the review of her operational records, the framework she'd been trying to build, the notebook she'd been filling, not just here but for months before she arrived, on legal pads and in digital files she kept encrypted on a laptop she carried everywhere. She thought about the candidates on this course. Kowalski, who was excellent and knew it and was still hungry to be better. Vickers, who had cracked slightly under pressure and come out of it with better questions than he'd had before. Torres, who had made an error that cost his partner and had asked about it directly and without defense in the debrief. Brennan, who was quiet and steady and had the best unknown distance estimation instincts in the group and no idea how to articulate his own methodology. She thought about this girl who had started all of this, the 23-year-old who had shown up to her first sniper training cycle at Fort Bragg and been put in the worst position on the range every day for 2 weeks by an instructor who thought she didn't belong there and had shot her way into the qualifying scores anyway, and had never once received an explanation of why she was reading wind the way she was, just that she should do it that way, and had spent the next 4 years reverse engineering the methodology from the inside because nobody had ever taught her the framework. Yes, she said. I'm in. They told Hale at 0900. Pierce asked Lena to be present, which she suspected was less about her needing to be there and more about Hale needing to see her there. The framing mattered. If this was a decision delivered to Hale in her absence, she would always be something imposed on him. Present, she was something he had to engage with directly. He took it better than she'd expected and worse than she'd hoped. He listened to Pierce without interrupting, which required visible effort in the middle section of the explanation. His jaw set and released twice. His hands, folded on the table in front of him, didn't move, which she'd learned was how he managed emotion, by anchoring his hands and letting everything else be still. When Pierce finished, Hale said, With respect, sir, I'd like to understand the evaluation basis. The program has a documented performance record. Graduate outcomes? Graduate outcomes in theater don't match training outcomes on the range, Pierce said. Not unkindly, but without flex. We've been tracking it for 3 years. The gap is consistent. It's not a candidate quality problem. It's a curriculum alignment problem. Hale was quiet for a moment. And the solution is to hand program design to someone who has been here for 2 weeks. The solution is to pair the best range instructor I have with the best operational practitioner I can find and let them build something better than either could build alone. Pierce held Hale's gaze. You're one half of that equation. Hale looked at Lena. It was a direct look. Not hostile, but searching. The look of a man taking honest inventory. You identified the curriculum gaps, he said, from 2 weeks as a candidate. I identified some of them. You probably know more of them than I do. You've watched candidates graduate, and you've seen the follow-up reports. Some of them, he said. Then you know where the program breaks down better than any outside observer could. I don't want to design something from scratch and hand it to you. I want to understand what you already know about where it fails. He looked at her for a long time. Something shifted in his face. Subtle, but she'd learned to read him well enough to see it. The ownership defense softening into something more complicated. The Week 2 field protocol, he said. I've known for years that it doesn't translate to operational terrain. The exercises are too range-specific, but redesigning them requires resources I don't have and authority I wasn't given. Now you have both, Pierce said. Hale looked at the general, then back at Lena. He exhaled through his nose, a controlled breath that she recognized because she used the same one. You want to understand my failure mode data, he said. All of it, she said. Every graduate who underperformed in theater, every candidate who was excellent on this range and struggled in the field. I want to know what the pattern looks like from your side. Another silence. That's a lot of records. I have time. He looked at his hands, then he looked up. The Day 13 solo assessment, your after-action documentation. You included a methodology error. Yes. Why? She held his gaze. Because the error is data, and I'd rather lose points in a training evaluation than fail to document a gap that someone else might encounter. He was quiet for a full 5 seconds. That's not something I taught, he said. No, she agreed, but it might be something worth teaching. The formal announcement came that afternoon. Pierce assembled the candidates in the briefing room and told them the Week 3 evaluation would proceed as scheduled, with one change. The evaluation panel would include a program assessment component alongside the range evaluation, examining the candidates' understanding of their own methodology and their capacity to articulate failure modes in their own performance. Nobody missed the implication. The program was being changed, and the change was starting now. Kowalski found Lena afterward, outside the building in the pale afternoon sun. So, he said. So, you weren't here to qualify? No. He nodded slowly. Were you ever going to tell us? It wasn't my call to make, and it didn't affect the evaluation, yours or anyone else's. He looked out at the range for a moment. The 2,200-yard shot, Day 9. Were you performing for Pierce, demonstrating something? She considered the question carefully because it deserved a careful answer. I was shooting at a target 2,200 yards away in morning conditions with the wind I had. Pierce happened to be watching. That's not a full answer. No, she admitted. It's not. I knew he was watching, and I knew the shot mattered in a context beyond the course evaluation. But I wasn't shooting differently because of it. I was shooting the only way I know how to shoot. Kowalski thought about that. And how's that? Like it's the only shot I'm going to get. He was quiet for a moment. Is that something you can teach? She looked at him. That's the question, isn't it? He almost smiled. Is that a yes? It's an honest answer to a harder question than you think you're asking. She picked up her notebook from the bench. You're a good shooter, Kowalski. Better than good. But you know that already. What you don't know yet is how to read your own failure modes while you're inside them. That's the gap. And it's teachable. He stared at her. You've been evaluating us this whole time. Yes. All of us. Yes. He processed that. His jaw shifted slightly. And most of you are better than the program has had a way to measure. She paused. That's the problem we're fixing. He looked at her for a long moment, the assessment gaze of someone recalibrating their understanding of the last 2 weeks all at once. Then he exhaled. Well, he said. Okay then. The Week 3 evaluation ran as scheduled. Lena observed rather than participated. Pierce had made the formal reassignment clear to Hale, who had implemented it without visible resistance and with the quiet thoroughness of a man who, having decided to accept something, committed to it fully. He introduced her to the evaluation panel as Program Assessment Director, and he said it without inflection, without the slight strain that would have told the room he was managing a difficulty. He just said it. Lena sat beside Delaney during the evaluations and watched candidates perform. She watched Kowalski put a round through a steel plate at 1,900 yards in a moderate crosswind and then document his solution with the same precision he applied to the shot itself. She watched Vickers hold his nerve through a 2-target sequential engagement that required a rapid repositional between shots, an exercise she'd noted he would struggle with, and he did struggle, but he completed it, and his after-action articulation of what had gone wrong in the transition was specific and technically accurate. She watched Torres, who had cost Vickers an engagement in Week 2, take his individual assessment with careful methodology and hit 3 of 4 targets, then document the missed target with the kind of honesty that wasn't natural to him and cost him something to produce. She wrote all of it down. Not for the evaluation, for the curriculum redesign. The raw material of real performance, real failure, real adjustment, real recovery. The program needed this. Not abstractions about operational requirements, but the actual textures of how human beings performed under pressure and what they learned from it. On the final day, after the last candidate completed the evaluation sequence, Pierce called Hale and Lena into the range control office. He stood rather than sitting, which was his way of indicating brevity. Evaluation complete. Results will be processed through standard channels. He paused. Program redesign. I want a preliminary framework in 90 days. Hale looked at Lena. She looked back. 90 days is aggressive, Hale said. It's aggressive, Pierce agreed. That's by design. I don't want a completed product in 90 days. I want proof of concept. Enough to brief joint special programs and get the resources to do the full rebuild. He looked at both of them. Questions? Hale said, staffing. If we're developing scenario-based operational content, I need people who've operated in the relevant theaters. Mercer will provide a list, Pierce said. People she's worked with and can vouch for. Hale looked at her. You have a list? I can build one. From your operational history? Yes. He nodded once. All right. And then, after a pause that carried the weight of everything that had shifted between them over the past 2 weeks, it's a better program than the one we've been running. I want you to know I believe that. Whatever I thought when Pierce first told me this morning. She held his gaze. I know, she said. That's why it's going to work. He almost nodded. Maybe he did nod. It was a small movement, the kind that could be mistaken for nothing if you weren't watching closely. Pierce looked at both of them, satisfied with something he didn't put words to, and walked out. The office was quiet. Through the window, the range was visible in the last of the afternoon light. The long corridor of hardpan, the ridgelines going orange and purple at the edges, the steel targets at their various distances standing patient and still. She'd been looking at that range for 3 weeks, and she was still not entirely done with it. 90 days, Hale said. We should start Monday, she said. He looked at her. You want to start Monday? I want to start now. Monday is a concession to logistics. The corner of his mouth moved. It was the smallest possible version of what it wanted to be. A genuine thing that he mostly contained out of professional habit or the discomfort of new territory or both. Monday, he said. 0700. 0600, she said. He looked at her for a moment. 0630. Done. He walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, didn't turn around. Mercer. Sergeant. The 2,200-yard shot, day 9. A pause. I've been running this range for 11 years. I've seen a lot of first-round engagements at max distance. Another pause, shorter. That was the best I've ever seen. He walked out. She stood in the empty office and looked at the range until the light was almost gone and the steel plates disappeared into the dark, and she thought about all the things it had taken to get to this room, this conversation, this beginning, and she felt the particular tiredness that arrives not after failure, but after something has finally, after a long time, landed where it was supposed to land. Then she picked up her notebook and walked out into the Nevada evening. The Monday morning came in cold and clear, the way Nevada mornings did when the season had finally committed to itself. No ambiguity in the air, no leftover warmth pretending summer wasn't finished. Lena was at the range control building at 0610, 20 minutes before she'd agreed to, and found Hale already there with 2 cups of coffee on the table and a whiteboard that he'd erased and remarked with a rough structural outline of the current curriculum. He'd been there a while. She looked at the whiteboard without sitting down. He'd broken the 11-week program into phases with estimated time allocations, and beside each phase he'd written, in his precise block lettering, a single word or phrase in red marker. Range specific, instrumented dependent, no field transfer, controlled only, gap. He'd done his own audit without being asked. Overnight, or close enough to it. She set her bag down and picked up the black marker from the tray. You started, she said. I've known about some of these problems for a long time. His voice was flat, not defensive. I didn't have the authority or the resources to address them. Now I do. He paused. I wasn't going to wait until 0630 to start. She looked at the whiteboard for a moment. Then she uncapped the marker and added 3 items to his list that he hadn't written. Evaluation timing, scenario context integration, failure mode documentation requirements, and stepped back. He studied them. The failure mode documentation. That's what you did on the Day 15 assessment. It should be a required component of every live evaluation, not optional, not extra credit. The candidates will sandbag it. They'll document minor errors and protect themselves from documenting the real ones. Some will, for a while. Then they'll figure out that the instructors are using the documentation to calibrate the curriculum, and documenting accurately makes the training better for them. She paused. You have to build the culture first. The behavior follows. He looked at her. You've done this before, not formally, but you've led people. Some. In the field. Yes. He seemed to want to ask more and decided not to. All right, let's start with week 1. They worked for 4 hours without a real break. The preliminary framework came together over 6 weeks, not 90 days. Not because they rushed it. They didn't rush it. They were methodical in ways that occasionally frustrated the Joint Special Programs liaison, who checked in every 2 weeks and seemed to have expected something less thorough. But because they worked well together in the specific way that people with complementary knowledge work well together when neither of them is managing ego. Hale knew the range, the candidates, the failure patterns of 16 years of training cohorts. Lena knew the operational environments the candidates would enter, the atmospheric conditions of the theaters, the terrain types, the decision-making pressures that didn't exist on a proving ground range and couldn't be simulated without deliberate design. The first disagreement came in week 2 of the redesign. It was about the week 1 curriculum. Hale wanted to keep the positional fundamentals phase intact. He was right that it was technically sound, and he was attached to it in the way instructors become attached to elements of a program that they've refined over years. Lena wanted to compress it by 40% and use the recovered time to introduce field condition observation in the first week rather than the second. They went back and forth on it for 2 days. You're compressing the foundation to accelerate to applications, Hale said. He wasn't yelling, he never yelled, but his voice had the particular edge of someone who thought they were watching a mistake being made. The foundation is sound. What's not sound is waiting until week 2 to expose candidates to variable conditions. By the time they reach fieldwork, they've been trained for 2 weeks in controlled conditions, and they've started to expect control. That expectation is what produces the performance gap in theater. If their foundational positioning is weak, their foundational positioning is not weak. Look at your own washout data. She slid a folder across the table. In the last 5 cycles, positional errors accounted for 11% of washout causes. Environmental reading failures accounted for 63%. The program is spending proportionally more time on the smaller problem. He opened the folder. He looked at the numbers. He was quiet for longer than he usually was when he disagreed with something. Where did you get these? He said. From the records you gave me. I didn't pull these specific. I compiled them from the individual candidate records you gave me. They're your numbers. He looked at the data for another moment. Then he closed the folder. 30% compression, he said. Not 40. 35. A pause. 32. She looked at him. 32 is an odd number. It accounts for candidates who test into the course with significant positional deficiencies. We keep the remedial track at full length. She thought about it. That's actually a better solution than what I had. I know, he said. Not arrogant, just accurate. They moved on. Potem. Delaney left Iron Ridge at the end of week 3, back to whatever program he'd come from, but before he left, he sent Lena a 3-page technical memo analyzing the environmental reading methodology she'd used during the course evaluation and comparing it to existing documented approaches. He'd found 2 parallel developments in unrelated research programs, one from a Scandinavian military training school, one from a domestic weather service field operations manual, that used similar logic for different applications. At the bottom of the memo he'd written, in handwriting rather than typed, the framework you're developing isn't new in its components. What's new is the integration. That's usually where the actual advances happen. She pinned it to the wall above the whiteboard. Garrett came back in week 4. He came alone this time, without Pierce, and he sat in the range control office and asked questions for 3 hours with the flat efficiency of someone whose job was to identify programs worth funding and eliminate programs that weren't. He went through the preliminary framework section by section, and his questions were good, specific, technically grounded, aimed at the actual load-bearing elements of the design rather than the presentation. Halfway through the session, he asked about the operational scenario component. "You're proposing to introduce live threat simulation in week 2, he said. "That's not something the current facility supports." "No," Lena agreed. "We'd need to modify the range layout and add scenario control infrastructure. That's a capital cost. Significant capital cost. Yes. Justify it." She looked at him. "If we continue graduating snipers who can hit at 1,800 yards on this range and can't perform under operational pressure in theater, we're not producing snipers. We're producing range shooters. The cost of operational failure is higher than the cost of building a scenario infrastructure." "That's a qualitative argument. You want quantitative." "I want whatever is true." She reached into the folder in front of her and pulled out a document she'd put together over the previous 10 days. Operational performance data, cross-referenced against training records, theater after-action reports. Cross-referenced against range evaluation scores, failure mode analysis by phase of training. It had taken her a significant amount of time and several calls to people she trusted in operational commands who had sent her data. They probably weren't supposed to send through unofficial channels. She slid it across the table. Garrett picked it up. He read it the way he did everything, methodically, without expression. He turned pages without comment. He went back to 2 pages and reread them. "This data," he said. "Some of this came from classified after-action channels." "Yes." "You have access to those channels." "I have relationships with people who do." She paused. "The data is accurate. The sourcing is my problem, not the program's." He looked at her over the document. "That's a generous way to frame it. It's an accurate way to frame it." He set the document down and was quiet for a moment. "The scenario infrastructure. What's your minimum viable build?" I drew it up. She pulled out the last page in the folder. He took it, looked at it. "That's what we need to run a meaningful first cohort through the redesigned program. Not everything. Enough." He studied the drawing. Not an architectural plan, just a clear annotated sketch of the range modifications with estimated dimensions and equipment requirements. The same kind of clear, spare problem-solving she applied to everything. "I'll take it back to the program office," he said. "No promises." "I understand." He stood, picked up his jacket, then stopped. "The candidate data from this evaluation cycle," he said. "You documented individual performance profiles on all 14 candidates." "Yes, as part of the curriculum redesign research. Those profiles are more detailed than the standard evaluation records, significantly. Are they part of the program materials or separate?" She considered. "They're research. They belong to the redesign process. Whether the program office has access to them is your call, not mine." He looked at her for a moment. "Most people would have offered them as a deliverable without being asked. To demonstrate thoroughness. Most people would have. I thought about it." "Why didn't you?" "Because those profiles document how 14 specific soldiers failed under pressure. That information should be used to improve training, not to build personnel files." She met his eyes steadily. "If the program office wants them for curriculum research, I'll provide them. If they want them for something else, I won't." Garrett held her gaze for a long moment. Whatever he was assessing, he finished assessing it. "Curriculum research," he said. "That's all." "Then you'll have them by end of week." He left. Lena sat in the empty office for a moment and felt the particular tiredness of a negotiation that had required constant attention to where the lines were. The funding came through in week 7. Not the full capital build, partial. Enough for the scenario infrastructure minimum, with a commitment for the remainder contingent on first cohort outcomes. Hale read the approval letter twice, set it on the table, and looked at Lena. "That's faster than I expected," he said. "Garrett moved it," she said. "He wanted proof of concept before the fiscal quarter closed." "How do you know that?" "Because he told me the timeline when he left, and I know what fiscal quarter timing looks like in program office decisions." Hale looked at her. "You've navigated program office politics before." "Once or twice." "In the field?" "In the parts of the field that look like offices." He nodded slowly. "Right." He picked up the letter again. "Range modification starts Monday?" "I've already called the contractor. They're available starting Wednesday." He put the letter down. "You called the contractor before the funding was confirmed?" I called to check their availability. There's a difference. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize, the one that appeared when she'd done something he would have done himself, given the same certainty, but wouldn't have admitted to out loud. Wednesday, he said. Wednesday. The range modifications took 3 weeks. During that time, Lena designed the first cohort curriculum in full, week by week, day by day, exercise by exercise. She built it in the notebook first, the way she built everything, and then transferred it to the program documentation with Hale, reviewing each section, marking it up in red, and returning it with the particular thoroughness of someone who had decided that if he was going to co-own something, he was going to co-own it completely. They disagreed several more times. The Week 3 scenario design, a 2-day simulated operational deployment that was significantly more complex than anything in the current program, produced the longest disagreement, spanning parts of 3 separate working sessions. You're going to break candidates who aren't ready for this complexity, Hale said. Some of them, yes. That's a washout rate problem. It might be. Or it might be that we're currently passing candidates who would have washed out under realistic conditions, and we don't find out until they're in theater. He was quiet. Hale, look at your own data again. The candidates who struggled most in Week 2 field conditions, where did they wash out in previous cycles? He knew the answer before she finished the question. He'd looked at the same record she had. Week 1, positional and technical fundamentals. They were excellent technicians. They washed out on technique. They were carried through on technical scores and then couldn't transfer to field conditions. Because the field conditions weren't introduced early enough. Because the program was optimized to produce technical scores rather than field-capable operators. She paused. We're building something different. Some of the candidates who would have graduated the old program won't graduate this one. Some who would have washed out on the old program will make it through this one. The population shifts. That's the point. He sat with it for a moment. The washout rate increase is going to draw scrutiny. Yes, which is why we document everything from day one: methodology, candidate profiles, decision rationales. When the scrutiny comes, we have the data to explain every outcome. He looked at the scenario design, then at her. You've already planned for the scrutiny. I've planned for the conversation the scrutiny will require. There's a difference. The corner of his mouth moved again. That small, contained thing that was as close as he came to a real expression in a working context. Fine, he said. The scenario stays, but I want a graduated complexity structure. Candidates get a simplified version in Week 2, full complexity in Week 3. They're not going into the deep end without building the swim first. That's a better design than what I had, she said. I know. The first cohort arrived in January. 12 candidates. Mixed backgrounds, Rangers, Marine Scout snipers, 2 Special Forces soldiers, 1 Air Force combat controller who had the best natural wind-reading instinct Lena had seen since she'd left Phantom Lance. They arrived with the same energy the previous cohort had arrived with, the particular confidence of people who had been the best shooter in every room they'd been in and expected this to be another version of that room. Hale ran the opening brief. He was crisp, thorough, and he introduced the program changes without apology or explanation. Just stated them as the way things were, which was the correct approach. If you explained too much, candidates started looking for the reasons behind the reasons, and the reasons behind the reasons were complicated enough that they could become distracting. Then he said, Program Assessment Director Mercer will be conducting the first environmental orientation this afternoon. 12 faces turned to look at her. She recognized the sequence: assessment, recalibration, the particular blankness of people deciding what to do with information that didn't match their expectations. She'd seen it before. She was less patient with it than she used to be, but she understood it. She stood. 01300, she said. Range corridor. Bring your notebooks. She walked out. Behind her, she heard the low murmur of the room reconfiguring itself, and she didn't turn around. The afternoon orientation was where she first identified him. His name was Castillo. 26 years old, Army Ranger, 2 combat deployments, a range evaluation score high enough that he'd been pushed to the front of the wait list for this cohort. He was one of the loudest candidates in the group during the morning. Not aggressively so, just present, taking up the natural space of someone used to being listened to. On the range, he was quiet. Lena had the group working through a basic environmental observation exercise, wind estimation at multiple distances using only terrain features and natural indicators, no instruments. And she was walking the line when she stopped behind Castillo and watched him for a moment without him knowing. He was watching the wrong indicators. Not wrong exactly. The flags at the 500-yard line were legitimate wind data. But he was anchored to them, returning to them every few seconds as his primary reference, when the more reliable and more relevant data at this range orientation was coming from the vegetation behavior at the 800 and 1,100 markers. He was doing what the old curriculum had trained him to do without knowing that's what he was doing. She moved on. She watched 3 more candidates. 2 of them had the same anchoring pattern. One, the Air Force combat controller, a woman named Reyes who moved quietly and watched everything, was reading the vegetation at the far markers correctly and didn't know she was doing anything different from anyone else. After the exercise, Lena stood in front of the group with the wind data from the instruments. "Everyone's estimate for the mid-range wind condition," she said. "Castillo." He gave his estimate. It was off by 4 knots and 12 degrees of direction. Not terrible, not correct. "What were you reading from?" "The 500-yard flags, primarily." "Primarily? What else?" He thought for a moment. "The dust on the range road." "What were the flags telling you?" "South-southwest, about 12 knots." "And the dust?" A pause. "The same, roughly." "Reyes," she said. The combat controller looked up. "Ma'am." "Your estimate." Reyes gave it 8 knots, south-southwest, rotating slightly right at the mid-range, closer to the instrument reading by a significant margin. "What were you reading from?" Reyes thought about it. "The brush at the far markers, the way it was moving." She paused. "It looked different from the flags. I wasn't sure which one to trust." "You were reading both and weighting the far marker data," Lena said. "Which was the right call? Why do you think the far marker data is more useful for a mid-range engagement?" Reyes worked through it out loud. She got most of it right, and one piece slightly wrong, and Lena let her correct the wrong piece herself rather than correcting it for her, which took another 30 seconds but cost nothing. Then she turned to Castillo. "You're anchored to the near indicators," she said. "Not an accusation, a fact." He processed it. "Because that's what we were trained to—" He stopped. "Because that's how you were trained," she agreed. "It's a good starting point. The near indicators are reliable and easy to read. The problem is that between 800 and 1,200 yards, the terrain features in this corridor create a deflection effect that changes the wind behavior significantly. If you're reading the 500-yard line and ignoring the far marker vegetation, you're building a firing solution from data that doesn't accurately reflect the conditions at the target." He looked at the range. She watched him look at it differently than he had before. "How do you know which indicators to anchor to?" he said. "You read all of them. Then you weight them by relevance to the target distance. Near indicators tell you about your immediate environment. Far indicators tell you about the target environment. The target environment is what matters." She paused. "This is week 1, day 1. You're going to learn a systematic approach to this over the next 3 weeks. What I'm telling you right now is just the frame." He nodded. His jaw was set in the particular way of someone absorbing something that required restructuring rather than addition. She moved on to the next exercise. Afterward, Hale fell into step beside her as she walked back to the range control building. "Castillo," he said. "He'll be fine. He's fixable. I've seen that anchoring pattern wash out candidates who couldn't break it. He'll break it. He identified the problem in real time when it was pointed out. That's the variable that matters." She thought for a moment. "Reyes is the one I want to watch." The combat controller. "She's reading terrain intuitively without knowing she's doing it. That means the methodology is already there. She just needs the framework to understand and control what she's already doing naturally. Those are the candidates who make the biggest jumps." Hale was quiet for a moment. "You identified all of that from one observation exercise." "It's what I was here to do." He walked beside her in silence for a few steps. The winter air was sharp and still, the range settling into the long quiet of a Nevada afternoon. "You're a different kind of instructor than I am," he said. "Yes." "Not better or worse?" "Different," she agreed. "The program needs both." He thought about that. "I've been running this course for 11 years," he said. I thought I understood what it was trying to do. You understood what it was doing. What it was trying to do is different. He stopped walking. She stopped too. Is that a meaningful distinction in your framework, or are you just correcting my grammar? She looked at him. The program was doing excellent technical training. What it was trying to do, what any training program should be trying to do, is produce people who can operate effectively when the training ends. Those aren't the same objective, and for 11 years the curriculum was optimizing for the first one without fully accounting for the second. He stood there looking at the range for a moment. She waited. I knew that, he said. I knew it, and I couldn't fix it, and I kept running the program I had because it was better than nothing. He paused. I want you to know that I knew it. I know, she said. That's why I wanted to work with you and not replace you. He looked at her. The afternoon light was flat and cold, and it was honest, the way light got in winter. No flattery in it, nothing softened. He stood in it without flinching. Okay, he said, let's go build something better. Bob. The first cohort graduated 11 of 12 candidates, a washout rate that raised the scrutiny Lena had predicted. She spent 2 days in back-to-back calls with Garrett and the program office explaining the outcome data, walking them through the candidate profiles, demonstrating through documented evidence that the candidate who washed out had been misassigned to the course from the beginning. His performance gaps were foundational, predating anything the curriculum could address. And the old program would have graduated him with marginal scores and sent him to a theater environment where those gaps would have had consequences. Garrett listened. He asked his specific economical questions. He went away. A week later, the funding for the second phase of range infrastructure came through without conditions. Reyes graduated first in cohort. Castillo graduated fourth, which was lower than his entry assessment scores would have predicted, and exactly where his actual performance put him. And he accepted that with the particular grace of someone who had learned something about the difference between those two things. In his exit evaluation, he documented, without being prompted, 3 specific moments during the program where he'd identified himself inside a performance error and corrected it in real time. His documentation of the third error, a ranging mistake on the day 17 assessment that he'd caught and corrected without it affecting his score, was the most technically precise failure analysis in the cohort. Lena read it twice. 6 months after the first cohort graduated, Pierce came back to Iron Ridge. He didn't announce the visit, the way he never announced visits. He arrived at 0700 on a Tuesday and walked the range with Hale and Lena for an hour, watching the second cohort work through the Week 2 field exercises in the modified range corridor. The scenario infrastructure was fully operational now. A small city block mock-up on the western spur, a vehicle course on the eastern approach. Target systems that could be remotely configured for movement, partial concealment, or multi-target sequences. He watched a candidate named Obi, a Marine Scout sniper who was the best natural shooter in the second cohort, work through a scenario that required him to range a partially obscured target, establish a firing solution, hold the shot for a 40-second window while a simulated patrol element cleared his firing lane, and engage when the window opened. Obi held the position through the wait with the stillness of someone who'd been trained to understand that the waiting was part of the job, broke the shot clean when the window opened, and then documented his decision timeline in the after-action card without being told to. Pierce watched the documentation happen. That behavior, he said, the after-action documentation, that's new. We built it into the culture from day 1 of the first cohort, Lena said. Second cohort is inheriting it. How? First cohort candidates come back as observer evaluators during week 1 of subsequent cohorts. They model the documentation behavior in front of new candidates before the new candidates have formed habits. Pierce looked at her. That wasn't in the preliminary framework. It occurred to me during first cohort. I added it, and Hale approved the addition. Hale suggested making the first cohort observer role a formal program component rather than an informal one. I agreed. Pierce looked at Hale, who was watching Obi complete his after-action documentation with the expression of a man who had stopped being surprised by outcomes and started being satisfied by them. How is the program? Pierce asked. The question was addressed to both of them. Hale answered first. Better than what we were running. It needs another 2 cohorts before I'll make claims about long-term outcomes. Mercer? She thought about Reyes, who was now in a pre-deployment training cycle, and had sent her a 2-paragraph email describing how she'd used terrain feature wind reading in a field evaluation, and it had worked exactly as the framework predicted. She thought about Castillo, whose after-action documentation had become something other instructors on the course asked to reference when they were training candidates on failure mode analysis. She thought about the candidate who had washed out of first cohort. She'd followed his reassignment, made sure he landed in a role that fit his actual capability profile, and he was currently performing well in it. She thought about the notebook on the desk in her office. A new one, the old one full, pages dense with curriculum notes and candidate observations and methodology refinements that she added to every week, because the program was a living thing, and living things didn't stop needing attention. "It's a start," she said. Pierce almost smiled. She'd learned by now that almost smiling was what he did instead of smiling. "That's an honest answer. It's the only kind I have." He looked at the range for a moment, the long corridor of Nevada hardpan, the modified infrastructure, the second cohort moving through exercises that hadn't existed 6 months ago. He stood in it with the composed attention he brought to everything, and for a moment she saw something in his face that wasn't strategy or assessment, something quieter than those things. Satisfaction, maybe. Or the particular piece of a man who has spent a long career trying to build things that matter and occasionally succeeded. "The firing position," he said. "The one you used for the 2,200-yard engagement. What about it?" "The range crew has been calling it something. I noticed it on the site map when I came in." He paused. "Mercer's Point." She looked at him. "I didn't ask them to do that," she said. "I know you didn't." He looked at the range. "They did it because that position is where the program changed, whether you were trying to change it or not." He paused. "That's how it usually works. The things that matter most tend to happen without the person in the middle of them trying to make them happen." She didn't say anything. "Good work," he said. And then he walked back toward the main building, the way he always left, without ceremony, without looking back, taking up exactly the space that was necessary and leaving everything else for the people who remained. Hale came to stand beside her. They watched the second cohort work. Obi was moving to his next position. Behind him, a candidate named Walsh, quiet, technically precise, the kind of shooter who made no noise and no mistakes and had been largely invisible in week 1, was settling into her prone position with the particular stillness that Lena recognized, the kind that wasn't trained out of someone, the kind that was already there, waiting. "Walsh," Lena said. Hale looked. He watched for a moment. "I see it." "She's reading the terrain. She's reading the terrain," he agreed. "Nobody taught her that yet." "No." He was quiet for a moment. "That's the variable that matters. That's what you told me about Reyes." "Yes." He stood there, watching Walsh settle further into the position, watching the candidate's eyes move across the range indicators in exactly the right sequence, without knowing it was the right sequence. "I've been doing this for a long time," he said. "I've seen a lot of candidates." "I know. I've never had a way to identify that before, the ones who were already doing it." He paused. "I would have run her through the standard curriculum and graduated her with average scores and sent her out and never known what she could actually do." Lena watched Walsh break a shot on the downrange target. The steel rang. "Now you know," she said. He nodded. One solid, deliberate nod. The Nevada afternoon settled around them, the range quiet between exercises, the winter light flat and clean across the hardpan, the ridge lines holding their stillness. At Mercer's Point, the steel plate at 2,200 yards stood in the distance where it always stood, small and patient and honest. A piece of tape had been fixed to the post below the position marker. Someone had written on it in black marker, in the casual handwriting of a range crew worker who hadn't thought much about it. Mercer's Point, first round, 2,200 YE deeds, cold bore, NUV cycle. Below that, in different handwriting, someone had added 3 words. She was quiet. It was the most accurate thing anyone had written about her. She picked up her notebook and walked back to work. True excellence never announces itself. It simply shows up, does what it has always done, and leaves the proof in the record for everyone who finds